Hi there, everybody.
Hello there.
Uh, Hello. This is the first time I've seen Elizabeth in about 6 months, so there we go. We've not really practiced very much about this, so I apologise if it seems a little shaky and jumpy in places. But we're both very, very fortunate to have been uh, able to write about stuff, and our book is, we like to think it's as definitive as a book ever could be. For me personally, because I'm older, my first book was in 1988. It was called The Race to Mars. That was meant as a pun, by the way, meaning the human race to Mars. And I went out to Boulder in Colorado it was the Case for Mars 3, and met people like Chris McKay and Carol Stoker, who I gather have been talking to you this week. And it was very interesting then because I took cabs to the university from the hotel I was staying in and asked people, do you think we will, do you think people should go to Mars? And I would say 50-50. Some people said we should go, other people said no. So that was 32 years ago. The last time I went down to London was when I met Elizabeth, when we'd worked out how we'd write this book. And I asked reasonably randomly people, strangers, about what they thought about going to Mars. And what's happened now, which is quite interesting, is people get it. People understand that it's going to happen. And I think for the Humans to Mars conference that you've got here, that's quite significant. I don't think Humans to Mars is science fiction, far future stuff. I think people have accepted it emotionally. So I wanted to start with that because I think that's a fairly significant thing that's happened in recent years. Obviously, Elizabeth and I are reporters, so we are coming from a different perspective than a lot of the speakers. And what we wanted to try and do today was to say how the business has changed of how you actually report, because I think that will be very significant in the future. And I think that the question of life on Mars is one of those things that everybody gets and has been wondering about for centuries, and I think will be a key element to when we actually human beings land on Mars, why we will do it, because people will want to know, is there or has there ever been life on Mars? And I think, as Elizabeth will now say, it's what you might call a pivot. It's a very, very important thing that we'll be learning about. So over to Elizabeth.
So first, I want to talk a little bit about the how the business of reporting has changed. And I mean, obviously, Nick has been around for quite a bit longer than I have, but I've still been in the field for about 20 years myself. And what happened to me was actually in the year 2009, which is a very tough year in the reporting business. It was right during the middle of the recession. I was tweeting a lot, and Twitter was very young at the time. And I guess I was back then what you would call an influencer now, but of course, there are many, many more prominent people than myself. So I was just tweeting about space. I was working at another job and doing space sort of on the side, any kind of reporting that I could grab. And then NASA very kindly reached out to me and they said, listen, we're going to be running our first tweet up, our first meetup of Twitter people at a space shuttle launch in just a few weeks or months. And we're wondering if you wanted to come. And I said, I most certainly would want to come. I've been watching the space program since I was a kid, and I saw the movie Apollo 13 back in the 1990s when I was a teenager. I wanted to be a space person of some sort. I started with wanting to be an astronaut and kind of morphed into writing about astronauts, writing about that side. So down I went. And I have to say that it was quite an experience being at the Kennedy Space Center, working with a number of people in the public who were so interested in space inherently. And at the same time that I was seeing reporting opportunities diminish in my own field, I was seeing this rise of other sorts of people being able to contribute to the conversation productively and publicly. So instead of just doing scientific conversations, for example, in conferences, of course, now we can do it online in so many different forums, not just Twitter, obviously, but even in places like TikTok. So that's where I first was beginning to see that back in 2009. And it made me realize that out of all these reporting changes could come a lot of, pun intended, with the Mars mission opportunity. So then what happened was NASA, obviously, as well as ESA and the other space agencies, were beginning to see this opportunity as well about new ways of spreading information among the public, working still with reporters, those of us who managed to stay on, but then also trying to do independent things. And so I went to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory about a year ago, got to see the Perseverance rover coming together back when it was still called Mars 2020. And I had a conversation with Veronica McGregor about some of the changes that the social media team has been trying to implement over the years to really bring in folks. And so she was pointing out that each of the Mars missions, for example, that JPL runs on Twitter tend to have their own distinctive character. And so Curiosity, as you probably notice, is a little bit, I don't quite want to use the word sarcastic in a bad way, but just sort of like picking at things and having a little bit of fun and just trying as best as possible to be cheerful in the way that it brings out science findings and also things that are going along. And then meanwhile, we had another example going on with the NASA InSight mission, which was our nightmare as we were writing this book because it kept changing. But as we all know, that drill wasn't working and they're still sort of working through different ideas about how to get that done. And so that mission was coming forward with a whole lot of perseverance and innovation, and that Twitter feed was actually sort of an inspirational point because people from all over the world were actually sending ideas to JPL through Twitter and through other types of social media to give a chance to this little drill that was trying to get going on Mars. And so Veronica was saying that people really have jumped on board. People have been willing to be filmed while constructing the rovers, for example, which is something that JPL never imagined back then. And there really is this wonderful opportunity to be engaging with people in a new forum. And I've been in sort of positions of authority in other places, and I've been saying to folks that I really feel that space journalism is not just a function of people who went to journalism school like myself, but it's also people that are participating and sharing their findings, which means that just about any of us can be doing this now with social media. And I'm so glad to see that scientists and institutions and individual missions are doing this. So that's sort of the perspective on social media. I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the latest findings on Mars. Now, obviously, sitting in a group of scientists, I'm feeling a little bit intimidated because I do have my PhD, but it was more in a psychology focused field. So forgive me as I'm trying to parse through this. I think that one of the most important things that we can be talking about at Mars is this methane signature, because it's been puzzling us for a long time. As people in this virtual room well know, we've been taking a look at the red planet for decades and decades. We're seeing different types, not different types, but different measurements of methane, different amounts of it, depending on when we're looking at it. And it doesn't seem to be really seasonal. It doesn't seem to be really situational, not really in one spot. We've had measurements from telescopes. We've had measurements from orbit. We've had measurements from a Curiosity rover, obviously on the ground. All we can tell right now is it's not, it's not something that has a pattern. It's something that seems to happen almost randomly, but we're trying to understand what it is. So methane clearly can be a biosignature, but can also be a signature of something else happening on the planet, such as volcanoes. One of the more intriguing recent findings I thought was coming out from actually the ESA side of things. So of course, the Trace Gas Orbiter has been there since 2016, doing a lot of underrated work, trying to understand the smaller components of gas at Mars, because as we all know, it's a mostly carbon dioxide filled atmosphere, but there are little types of gas that can influence these larger types. And so what they have found was carbon dioxide and ozone measurements have been done a little bit more precisely than in the past. And what they're saying is that sometimes where the concentrations of these gases seem to be most prominent seems to be where methane has been observed in the past. Now, why exactly this is happening is something that we can't quite get our hands around yet, although maybe the scientists have a little bit more insight because they're working with the data as it comes to hand. However, what is interesting about this is that if we get more precise instrumentation and if we keep sending missions out there, then it can begin to show us a little bit more in terms of what might be going on. And so obviously we're having different types of observations. These new detections were done in infrared light. Usually actually ozone is done using ultraviolet measurements. And what that means is that if you have these two types of measurements, they actually look at different altitudes. And we need to really get a good profile of what's happening at different altitudes of Mars, kind of build it up layer by layer by layer, which is funny because when I talk to people who work in the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, etc., they do talk about those layers of gas very much more distinctly, probably because they're so much larger. But we also have to be thinking at it more of a micro scale at places like Mars and also on Earth to try and understand where life-bearing gases might be and what they might be showing. So anyway, just keep following that mission, because it's just part of that larger network of Mars missions that's going to be giving us more information about methane. Curiosity will continue to provide measurements from the surface, and obviously as the new rovers come in, they'll be doing the same thing. So that's just one of the newer findings I wanted to highlight. And then I think I'll bring it back to Nick now so that he can keep on going and talk a little bit more about the history. He actually was participating in it too, which is pretty cool.
That's Elizabeth's polite way of saying I'm old, but there we go. To me, the whole business of looking at Mars and looking for life on Mars is that's way I can describe it, and I'll use my hands, is like a pendulum, that we've been heading towards the possibility of life, and then we've been coming back. And all throughout history, this kind of pendulum swing away, forward. And what's really exciting now is for the first time in 40 years, NASA is sending instruments that will land hopefully next February on the Perseverance lander that will look for biosignatures, and is the first time that that's been done in 40 years. I started being interested as a kid because, like everybody else at this conference, that the notion of life on Mars is just such a great idea. And I think all throughout history, people have wanted it to be true, which may seem like a strange statement, but I do think that that's had an effect on how people have viewed Mars. And the Vikings landed, I was 12. I still think it was the greatest space mission ever. And really, there was the kind of shock that it was the worst possible result, in the sense it didn't prove that there was life there, but it also didn't prove life wasn't there. And it was almost like being in a wilderness where you don't know what the answer is. Since then, the other missions have come along, and as Elizabeth said, the methane question is quite important. But the real key, the thing that Viking didn't discover, were the organics. And now Curiosity's discovered ancient organics on the surface. And also there's evidence that from the Viking observations, they might have missed some observations of unusual chemical species that might actually have caught fire. So they're organics. The evidence was there and it went up in a puff of smoke. Now, all this, he said, publicizing the book again, is in the book. We tried to do something different with the book. What we're trying to do is to tell a story. Elizabeth talked to Veronica McGregor at JPL, and there's a good interview about the idea of social media. And one of the problems with social media, as we know, is it's lots of spikes and hits, and there's no kind of through narrative. And that's really what we've tried to do in the book. And the greater story is the pendulum. It's now, I think, heading on its way back towards the possibility of life. When I started reporting on this, people used to close doors. If you talked about Mars, people would, say, come into my office, look around and close the door. Now people, will openly talk about the possibility. So it's a really, really good time. And I think, as I say, what's happened is people now can accept we will be going to Mars as human beings. And I think also the possibility of landing on Mars and possibly even finding some evidence. I don't think it will be, they land, they pick up a rock, break it open, and there's a trilobite or something. It will be lots and lots of scientific detective work over many, many years. And what is also interesting now is this great time. The minute that Perseverance lands, the clock is running for the sample return. Now, I'm an old geezer, and I think that will be in probably 10, 12 years' time, probably the last great spectacular in space that I will see. And it really, for me, is the moment in Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white to color, because the scientists we talked to basically said, yeah, we can send our missions there, but, what we really need to do is to bring back a sample and look at it with the full panoply of stuff that we can do in our laboratories. And that is the next big step. I think it will be fairly key before human beings land there. And as some of you know, on Perseverance, there's a couple of technologies that may be useful for human exploration in the future. One final thing I'm going to say, because we're aware of the time, is this year, writing a book in 2020 is, as was said in another context, a little bit like cooking a steak by having a succession of people coming in and breathing over it. It was quite interesting as we were trying to follow up what all the missions are doing, the latest information. But I do think one thing that we kind of touch on, which happened early this year, we're now living in this, what will be the post-viral world. And I think another significant step will be, once upon a time, the idea of landing on the moon with Apollo 11 and the idea that there might be, things in the moon rocks was fairly obscure. And then Michael Crichton came along and wrote the Andromeda Strain, and that became popular. What I do think is interesting now is that one of the themes that I think is going to come right through, that wasn't there while we were writing the book, but is now sort of, it's pretty obvious to me, will be, what are we going to do if we bring back something from Mars and there's some sort of pathogen in there? Now, I don't think there's any great chance of that, and most of the people we spoke to said that, but we were, you know, people now know what a contagion might be like. And I think for future exploration of Mars and sending humans there, I think that's going to be a narrative that will just suddenly start building. And that really is my last thing to say, because Elizabeth can talk a little bit about risks, which is a really interesting topic for the future. Because cheery soul that I am, we've written a book about the search for life on Mars. And I think what will be really curious for the future is when there occurs a death on Mars. And on that happy note, I'll hand back to my co-author.
See, what I think is really interesting about the future is we're going to have to think of new ways of getting to Mars. And clearly that's going to be not just one agency at a time. It's going to be multiple agencies working together and also in collaboration with commercial partners. And this is something that is becoming more and more of a trend. It seems to be heating up even more in the 6 months since we wrote the book into now. So for example, when I was virtually attending the International Astronautical Congress yesterday, there was a great discussion that was happening between Jim Bridenstine at NASA, Jan Werner over at ESA, and then a number of other facilities, mostly European, that were just discussing where their collaborations are going to be taking them forward. And what I thought was interesting was Mars was certainly a part of it, but that wasn't the only thing. They actually saw it as part of a network of collaborations that had to do with also the International Space Station with the moon. And so the idea is, for example, if we're able to deploy this experiment on the moon and then maybe try and figure out, for example, how to be communicating with a satellite when you're on the far side, you don't have that direct line of sight to Earth, you could bring that same kind of application over to Mars. And it just was a really fascinating conversation because they're not thinking in silos. They never were, but even more and more so, there's sort of this pathway where they're believing that they have to start working on the moon, at the International Space Station, closer to home, and then bring it out over into the red planet. And obviously, there's going to be some risks that are associated with this. Not only is it going to be the risk to human life, because when you're trying to be putting a settlement on the red planet or really anywhere else, if you're there for long periods of time, people are, just as a nature of being humans, going to do things like get sick. They're going to perhaps, at the worst, die, you know, if the thing happens. And so you have to think about ways of dealing with that. Also the question about whether you're going to be bringing families along, whether you're going to be trying to start families in these new areas, because we don't really know how the human fetus develops in these different environments. But there's also a lot of hope because this panel not only included, as I said, NASA and ESA, but there were huge companies in there as well. So these were, again, were mainly European, but Thales, Airbus, and of course they were mentioning entities such as SpaceX. And they were saying that if you're a young professional and you're looking to get involved in the space field, just go and find a little niche somewhere. You know, it doesn't have to be at a space agency anymore. You can go and work for a startup company that's working on satellites, for example, or you can try and find one of the larger integrators. And then what you do is you just kind of build it out for there. So there's really a chance for younger professionals, which is what we were trying to aim the book to, for younger professionals to come in, show their diverse skill set and also their diverse background, because you don't all have to be from one background anymore. They want different genders, they want different countries, they want different perspectives on how to bring things into space, because there's such a complexity in trying to build anything on Mars or anywhere else really, that you just need the diversity of thinking. Because heck, you know, that taking that drill down into the surface and with Mars InSight is complex enough. Imagine trying to get a human settlement out there. So I'll wrap up for questions, but I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. I know that it's a very difficult time grappling with what's happening in the world around us and trying to work from home. So Nick and I really do appreciate this, and we look forward to your feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first thing that I want to ask is basically something that I see consistently whenever someone talks about a sample return mission is protocols for contamination, and not just cross-contamination with organisms to Mars, but also when that comes back here to Earth, how do we prevent, as you mentioned, Nick, the pandemic type scenario or a biological agent getting loose on Earth? Can you speak any to that, of anything you found?
Yeah, I can speak in slightly more philosophical terms, because I looked at this 25 years ago when I was reporting, when it first became a possibility because of the Allen Hills meteorite, the story that was probably the greatest night I ever spent as a reporter. And what was interesting then was there was a panel that was convened by the National Academy of Science, I think it was, not the engineering. And there was a sort of fairly high-powered lawyer on that, which made me think this is something different. I'm now going to hand over back to Elizabeth because she went to JPL and talked to the people who are actually building the machines and the caches that will be brought back. So you probably, want a better expression, picked up better information than that. But I think philosophically, people have been thinking about it, but now it's really going to happen.
I think that just briefly, not being an engineer or a scientist myself, I'm more of a journalist by training. The impression that I got at JPL is they weren't just going to be working within the silo of space exploration. They were actually going to be branching out as much as they could to be talking to other types of facilities. And coincidentally, we now have a lot of experience with how to deal with this sort of thing because of coronavirus. We didn't know that back then, but now we actually have put a set of protocols even among our own societies to try and prevent transmission of a virus. I'm sure that there could be some kind of a cross cultural or cross-disciplinary discussion about how to do the same thing for a Mars microbe, although obviously it also takes a lot of engineering and different types of protocols as well, just briefly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you discuss a little bit more on how the relationship with the scientific community has changed over the past decade with the media?
Oh, I definitely can speak to that. So
Yeah.
when I was starting in journalism, I actually graduated in 2007. There was a very top-down approach to how these things were disseminated. So there would be a NASA press conference. It was barely online at the time. I didn't even have access to NASA television until very late in my journalism student career. And that was the way that things would flow. It just would sort of come out of a press conference. It'd be published into a newspaper or talked about very briefly on the news that evening. It actually was kind of frustrating when I was growing up to try and find science news and space news. Just briefly, I remember the hula hoop problems. I was trying to find Chris Hadfield's first spacewalk in 2001, and the Canadian television networks carried it for about 5 minutes. It was about long enough to see him go outside, and then that was it. And we had dial-up internet, and my parents very kindly let me get onto the dial-up internet and basically use our month's allotment just for that one spacewalk to see what was going on. These days, happily, a lot of us, not everybody, let me just mention that, but a lot of us have faster internet access. And there also is this idea where NASA is working, NASA and the other space agencies more clearly, is working directly with people who are really, really good in social media. And I don't really count myself among those anymore, but there are folks that have really popular YouTube channels, such as the Everyday Astronaut. So he's done a lot of stuff in collaboration with them. So they will be working with different social media influencers, and not just on Twitter, but also in social media. And they will be doing partnerships where they just kind of bring things together. They bring out the idea of space exploration, and they're trying to sort of go to each influencer's diverse audiences, and also to be presenting diversity as much as possible in their own broadcasts to do this. Just briefly, during the SpaceX launch, the commercial crew launch this summer, I was so impressed that NASA TV had pivoted really quickly to working directly with influencers. And also when you turned on the screen and you were watching the broadcast, they had an array of very different faces sitting there. It wasn't the 1960s anymore where it's all one gender, one race. There's a whole lot of people sitting there with their different experiences. And that's really going to be key to help us move forward.
5 minutes.
One thing I can say is when I was starting out, you used to write to JPL, and about 4 months later, a packet of pictures would arrive. And I think the great difference now is that all that information is there at the click of a button, and something like 21 million people around the world can see it more or less instantly. And I do think, I mean, we said this in the book, unfortunately we picked the wrong planet, I guess, when the book appeared in the UK, because it was the same day as the Venus story, but we said these sorts of stories will break on social media. And in fact, I think that's the way forward. Social media is the future and is how all this stuff will be presented. And, you know, so the book is an attempt to try and link everything together into a narrative. But for the future, just keep watching your channels, because that's where the news will appear.
So this next question also kind of applies to me. So you mentioned young professionals, but for those who are older, you know, maybe looking to potentially change careers, what kind of things can you recommend to maybe pivot to the space industry, or even look into some of these opportunities with, as you know, space becomes more accessible for everybody?
It really doesn't take a lot of technical expertise to be participating in the space program. And the thing is, too, if you're around the age that I am, sort of approaching 40s, getting into your 50s, and you still want to be contributing and haven't really formally studied it, there are ways that you can actually use your past expertise to come into it. So, for example, if I was starting from zero and I didn't really have the connections and everything that I have now, what I would start to do is get involved with some of the crowdsourcing projects that are being done through Zooniverse, Zooniverse. There are many others, but that's just one of the more prominent examples. What you can do is anybody, you could be 9, you could be 99, you can go in and you can categorize different types of data. They have things like asteroids, they have things like planets, you're looking at pictures, and you're just trying to classify it along with the scientists. And this is legitimate scientific work. It has been published many times in scientific journals. And so that's one of the fundamental ways you can do it. And also, I really urge folks to get involved into any kind of a community. So obviously, if you're sitting here with the Mars Society, there's a good spot to start. So what you do is you attend the conferences, you participate in committees, you really get involved with the day-to-day, almost like what some people would call the grunt work, but that's really where the fun happens. Because when you're sitting there really helping people with what is important to them, then those other benefits begin to flow to you because they see that you're enthusiastic and willing to kind of go behind the scenes. And frankly, that's how astronauts get into space, right? It's not because they are so smart, it's because they're really good team players. And just think about it that way when you're trying to be implementing your skills and joining communities. Be willing to offer up more than what you're going to be receiving, and that's usually when the benefits come. So please, everybody come in, no matter how old you are. It's really important that we get everybody's experience in here.
And also, I'm just going to chip in very quickly. The thing I started with, 32 years ago, the idea of going to Mars was still science fiction, and maybe I think people now understand it's going to happen. When will it happen? 20 years, 30 years? Doesn't matter. I think there'll be lots of opportunities for people from any background whatsoever. And I think that's the great thing. You don't just have to be a rocket scientist to be a rocket scientist anymore. You can contribute whatever it is. And if it's just enthusiasm and wanting to go to Mars, great, that's what you should do.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. And that was Zooniverse, Zooniverse.
SE, yes, exactly. And sorry, I did the Canadian Z. And the thing is, my name has a Z in it, and I should know better because every time I go to a press conference, I have to spell out my name and I forget the Z. So anyway, ZZZ, not Z. Ignore my Canadianness here.
No worries. One thing I saw, is there any known organism on Earth that would potentially thrive and become an invasive species on Mars that you know of?
Nick? I'm not a biologist.
No, I'm not I was going to say, you get the difficult questions. I'm not sure. One of the interesting things is is the first missions that landed to look for life, they sort of assumed that, two of the experiments assumed that if there were terrestrial type microbes, they would have adapted to the Martian conditions, but they didn't find anything, although there's some controversy about one of the experiments. But I'm not quite sure about that. But one thing that's happened certainly again in the last few years, and say the last 20 or 30 years, microbes have been found in the strangest places, inside nuclear reactor rods, 2 miles under the earth, under sort of very, very strong conditions of pressure and heat. So life seems to be slightly more hardier, I think, than people thought when the Vikings landed. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's more optimism now that life is hardier, and once it gets going, that's it. You'll still be able to find it.